Amazon API Gateway is a fully managed service that makes it easy for developers to create, publish, maintain, monitor, and secure APIs at any scale. APIs act as the front door for applications to access data, business logic, or functionality from your backend services. Using API Gateway, you can create RESTful APIs and WebSocket APIs that enable real-time two-way communication applications. API Gateway supports containerized and serverless workloads, as well as web applications. API Gateway handles all the tasks involved in accepting and processing up to hundreds of thousands of concurrent API calls, including traffic management, cause support, authorization and access control, throttling, monitoring, and API version management. API Gateway has no minimum fees or startup costs. You pay for the API calls you receive and the amount of data transferred out, and, with the API Gateway tiered pricing model, you can reduce your cost as your API usage scales. Amazon API Gateway allows you to design RESTful interfaces and connect them to your favorite backend. This service is for creating, publishing, maintaining, monitoring, and securing REST, HTTP, and WebSocket APIs at any scale. API developers can create APIs that access AWS or other web services, as well as data stored in the cloud. As an API developer, you can create APIs for use in your own client applications. Or you can make your APIs available to third-party app developers. It supports multiple API versioning like v1, v2, and handles different environments like dev, test, prod. It handles security authentication and authorization and handle request throttling. It can transform and validate requests and responses. When creating an API, AWS has three options. 1. API Gateway REST API is a collection of HTTP resources and methods that are integrated with backend HTTP endpoints, Lambda functions, or other AWS services. You can deploy this collection in one or more stages. Typically, API resources are organized in a resource tree according to the application logic. Each API resource can expose one or more API methods that have unique HTTP verbs supported by API Gateway. 2. API Gateway HTTP API is a collection of routes and methods that are integrated with backend HTTP endpoints or Lambda functions. You can deploy this collection in one or more stages. Each route can expose one or more API methods that have unique HTTP verbs supported by API Gateway. 3. API Gateway Websocket API is a collection of WebSocket routes and route keys that are integrated with backend HTTP endpoints, Lambda functions, or other AWS services. You can deploy this collection in one or more stages. API methods are invoked through front-end WebSocket connections. Next important aspect is the endpoint configuration. AWS supports three options. 1. Edge-optimized API endpoint, where data is served with CloudFront distribution to facilitate client access from different regions across globe. API requests are routed to the nearest CloudFront point of presence, also called as POP. This typically improves connection time for geographically diverse clients. 2. Regional API endpoint. This is mainly used if you want to serve traffic within a region. Here, API requests are targeted directly to the region-specific API Gateway API, without going through any CloudFront distribution. 3. Private API endpoint, where an API endpoint is exposed through interface VPC endpoint. This allows clients to securely access private API resources inside a VPC. Private APIs are isolated from the public internet, and they can only be accessed using VPC endpoints that have been granted access.